The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
Hello and welcome to What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Thomas Nagley, and with me tonight is Father William Jenkins. He's a member of the Society of St. Pius V. He's also the pastor of Immaculate Conception Church right here in Norwood, Ohio. Hello, Father. How are you?
Better, Tom. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thanks for your prayers. And you?
Doing well, Father. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Father, the emails continue to pour in, especially after our video where we referenced Taylor Marshall and Ryan Grant in the video that they made on St. Robert Bellarmine and the question of a heretical pope, the possibility of that. And so I'd like to answer one email in particular in regards to that program. This viewer says that in that show, Father Jenkins spent about 15 minutes explaining the 5 opinions of Bellarmine and then accused Marshall and Grant of ad-libbing and embellishing. I take issue with this accusation because it seems like Father Jenkins did not watch the entire video in question. Their discussion around a council making a declarative statement is in fact straight from Bellarmine, just not the controversies. It actually comes from on councils, as they say multiple times in the video. A dishonest response that sets up a straw man helps no one. So, Father, please redo the video with an accurate analysis, critiques, and responses for the benefit of the faithful. What's your response to that email, Father?
Well, I think that the viewer, sometimes they talk about our observant and noble viewer, but in this case, certainly this viewer caught something important here. And I didn't consider the remark I made to be an accusation exactly, but I guess it certainly, well, at least came across that way. And but I got word of this while I was traveling over the weekend and came back and checked into it with the help of a very good soul and actually photocopied the relevant information here. And the gentleman is quite right. St. Robert Bellarmine did, in fact, address that very issue of calling a council. He didn't bring it up, as I recall, he didn't bring it up in the Book of Controversies that we discussed and that Dr. Marshall and Ryan Grant had discussed, but he did bring it up in the 4th controversy, talking about the 4th general controversy, De Conciliis et Ecclesia Militante, on councils and the church militant. And that's the 4th book of this collection, and this appears in chapter 9, actually, Caput Nonum, as it's called. Fortunately, we were able to print out the actual Latin text of St. Robert Bellarmine, which I won't read, okay? But it's an interesting chapter, chapter 9 of this book 1, chapter 9 of book 1 from this 4th controversy. It's entitled De Utilitate vel etiam necessitate celebrandorum conciliorum, concerning the utility or also the necessity of celebrating a council. So when he talks about the necessity of calling a council, he says a council can, and even introduces the necessity of calling a council for these reasons. He gives 6 of them. And the first of them, he says, is because of a new heresy that has arisen, that has to be addressed and condemned by the Church. The second reason, he says, because of schism among Roman pontiffs, which is an interesting way of putting it. But as you read through, it's clear he's talking about, well, at least it's clear to me anyway, that he's talking about a time when there's confusion as to who is the true Roman pontiff. Obviously, there can only be one, right, at most. And I mean, there are 260 times in the history of the Church or so when there was no living Roman pontiff. A pope had died and another pope had not been elected. But this has to do with when there are maybe 2 or 3 claimants to the papacy. Obviously, only one can be the true pope, and anyone else would have to be an anti-pope, right? So that's another reason necessitating the calling of a council. And the third reason he gives is the council must be called to offer resistance to a common enemy of the whole church. So if the church is being attacked by a common enemy, then a council should be called to address that enemy. And the fourth reason he gives is relevant to this very question that we are talking about and that Dr. Marshall and Ryan Grant brought up. The fourth reason he gives is suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff, if perhaps that should arise or should happen. Or even to address an incorrigible tyrant, if there's incorrigible tyranny going on, right? To address the question of incorrigible tyranny. And he says, then it would be necessary to call a general council, either, he said, vel ad deponendum pontificem, either for the sake of deposing the pontiff. Curious choice of words, but that's what it says, vel ad deponendum pontificem, either for deposing or to depose the pontiff, si inveniretur hereticus, if he should be found to be a heretic. If he should be found to be a heretic. And then he goes on and says, or certainly to admonish the pontiff if he is seen to be incorrigible in his behavior. So those are two reasons he gives for calling a general council to address that question. And he says, if he is a suspect of heresy. So he actually doesn't even extend it to the need of a fact that there's a manifest heresy here. He's talking about just suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff is enough to necessitate calling a general council to address that. And then if he's found to be a heretic, then to depose him. But St. Robert Bellarmine doesn't mean in this, if you keep reading, he makes a distinction here that it wouldn't be the council audaciously, he says, audacter, deposing him. It would be a matter of really of simply making a declaration. What he's teaching is heresy. What he believes is heretical, right? In any case, there are translations of this. I think Ryan Grant himself offers a translation of this that is available, which I'd be interested in getting. Actually, I haven't gotten it yet. But in any case, it's interesting that this is the fourth of six reasons St. Robert Bellarmine gives in De Conciliis for the church needing to call a general council. By the way, the fifth reason he gives is because of the doubt concerning an election of the Roman pontiff. So if there's a doubtful election of the Roman pontiff, a council should be called to address that. The sixth reason he gives for the general reform of abuses and vices in the church. So it seems to me that virtually all of these reasons are present. Well, pretty much these reasons are present right now, militating for that. The trouble is, it gets back to what I was pointing out before. The first position is that the Pope couldn't possibly be heretical. The second position is that he could be even secretly heretical and would be immediately deposed. He would immediately lose the office. The third was he could be a manifest heretic and you couldn't do anything about it. He would necessarily be the Pope anyway, regardless, even if he's a manifest heretic, which, as you recall, St. Robert Bellarmine said no one believes, okay? He said no one holds to that position that a Pope can be a manifest heretic, and it has no consequences as to whether he's the Pope or not. But I pointed out that if they say that the necessity is to call a council today of bishops to address heresy in Francis, then that essentially relegates us to the third position, that there's nothing you can do about it, because he has packed the episcopacy and the College of Cardinals with modernists like himself. Right. And they would be more of a mind to excommunicate those who have the faith rather than to denounce someone who is a heretic. So in any case, we have a very practical problem with that position. So I answer your question. I point out that the writer of the email is absolutely right on there. So I have to make an amendment there and say that this does appear, in fact, in the writings of Robert Bellarmine concerning a council, but that still raises the issue that I see, again, a practical question, a very practical, I think, practical question, is if the point made by St. Robert Bellarmine in position number 5 is that a pope would lose the papacy when he becomes a manifest heretic, but you'd have to summon a council of bishops to examine that, discuss it, dispute it, pronounce upon it, and then announce that, yes, this is heresy. He is manifestly, let's say, believing, embracing, and professing heresy. Then you still have the question of the council saying, and now you must, in the sense that the practical consequence is, at this point, he must not be regarded as the Pope. Or he had lost the papacy when, in fact, he had pronounced the manifest heresy 5 months, 6 months, a year ago. And again, you get back to the question, well, if the council were to say, now we pronounce this fact as a declaration, and now he ceases to be the Pope for all practical purposes in the minds of anyone, does that not draw awfully close to the idea of the council deposing the Pope and saying he's not the Pope because we say so? Does that not risk that conciliarism? And if they were to say, well, he stopped being the Pope when he proclaimed his manifest heresy, when he pronounced it, when he professed his manifest heresy, then he stopped being the Pope, which could have been 5, 6, 7 months before, could have been a year or two before. But does this also not raise a specter, a practical problem, that I would actually appreciate Dr. Marshall and Ryan Grant addressing, maybe from the writings of St. Robert Bellarmine, because they're more, well, Ryan Grant is certainly more conversant with them than I am. Does this not raise all the specter that if you got the body of bishops together, I mean, even I'm abstracting from the idea of, we're talking about a Novus Ordo hierarchy here, modernists, right? Dyed-in-the-wool modernists, chosen for their modernism by Francis and so on. That if these bishops got together, even in normal times, that they would disagree. That the question of whether or not the Pope was a manifest heretic would have to be decided by them in council, and it could be that 2/3 of them believe, yes, that he's guilty of manifest heresy, he's pertinacious, he clings to that, he will not surrender that and profess the true faith, and 1/3 of the bishops would say, no, we don't see it that way. Well, then what do you do? What are people supposed to make of that? 1/3 of the bishops don't agree that he's a manifest heretic. So simply saying, well, we just call a council and the bishops would decide it. It's not that simple. And whether, the theologian Cajetan says so, or St. Robert Bellarmine, says, well, we'd have to have a council to decide this. There are certain very practical problems that are involved with this. And one could see coming out of this a schism if the bishops themselves could not agree whether a pope, in fact, was professing manifest heresy. So it's not simple. I realize that they're concerned, at least my understanding is they're concerned, that it's not up to an individual person to decide for himself whether the Pope is a manifest heretic, right? Mm-hmm. But, and I understand that. I mean, I understand that that is a cause for concern, right? But on the other hand, if a person personally is convinced that a Pope is a manifest heretic, even though there's been no declaration of any council, but he personally is convinced, as a matter of conscience, it's a manifest heretic. And these writers of the Church say it is perfectly Catholic to believe that he loses the papacy at that point. Well, then, what is a person to do? He can follow his conscience as a Catholic then, with that understanding. I would think. One might say, well, it's not up to the individual to declare, even for himself personally, that the Pope is a manifest heretic. Because he's not a manifest heretic until it is made official by a council of the Church. And my response to that would be, okay, well, I see your point, but I would ask you to see my point too. There are problems, practical problems with that too. In actually executing that decision, or even arriving at that decision. So anyway, it's not as easy as it seems, but I think people have to recognize, as I say, from what Dr. Marshall and Ryan Grant have said there, from St. Robert Bellarmine, that there are different positions that are perfectly Catholic, that the Catholic people with the faith can hold. And just because it might contradict another person's position, it doesn't make them non-Catholic. It doesn't make either of them non-Catholic. So, I mean, personally, I agree with St. Robert Bellarmine in this, and so many others who say that a pope who becomes a manifest heretic loses the papacy because he lost the faith. As far as how to apply that in the practical order to the individual and to the Church in its entirety, I see problems with the calling of a council to make that decision. And especially under the circumstances today, there's a unique problem which renders it almost out of the question, impossible, which would then put us in the third position, which is what St. Robert Bellarmine says no one holds to, that a pope can be a manifest heretic, but there's nothing you can do about it. So that's a problem. The Church is in serious straits today, and perhaps more serious than even at the time of the Arian heresy. And that's why it's absolutely essential that the Catholic people hold on to the traditional faith, the traditional rites of the Mass and sacraments, and not follow the new way. Because, the new way is the synodal way, and that's what takes us down the path of becoming pagans by the so-called ecumenical and synodal process. Mm-hmm. We talked about that in a recent program I did myself, with a very fine gentleman who was willing to get the cameras rolling late at night, so I would do that. I actually apologize for that, because I was not in good shape, and I know that, and it didn't come across very well. It was obvious that I wasn't feeling well. But I felt it was something necessary that needed to be dealt with, even if I wasn't as well prepared for it. I had just flown in from 3 days traveling the missions, and immediately became involved in pastoral responsibilities. I didn't have the time to prepare as I wish I'd had. But I hope people will look beyond that if they do watch that video. I think it's called Francis's Magisterial Dreams, Shaman Priests for the Amazon. And it talks about Francis's apostolic exhortation, kind of summing up the Synod on the Amazon and what he dreams is going to come of it. For traditional Catholics, it would be a nightmare. Mm-hmm. As a fine gentleman expressed to us shortly ago. In any case, I'm sorry.
No, that's good, Father.
We want to move on. I thank our writer though for giving me a heads up on that.
We do have a couple other emails that are along those same lines in regards to that program, and this one's from a viewer who says, "I am one of your new viewers from Dr. Marshall, and I recently ingested a few dozen of your videos. I want to say that your way of explaining things is amazing, and you have answered many questions I have looked for everywhere. One question I still have is this. You mentioned that we may have doubt whether Francis is the Pope due to the common opinion of theologians, which is the fifth position of St. Robert Bellarmine. Yeah. But do we then need to worry about having been separated from the Church for rejecting the authority of the Pope? Or is it avoided by us merely having the doubt?"
Well, if there is in fact a doubt, and not a scurrilous doubt, right, but an actual objective doubt based on reasons, in fact and in principle, in true Catholic principles, then one realizes that in ignoring the doubt and following the supposed authority, one is at risk of following an anti-pope, essentially. Someone who claims to be the supreme pontiff, but really isn't. And so one might ask yourself, well, there's a danger of rejecting, or there's a danger of not accepting the authority of a true pope, someone who might be a true pope, but there's also the danger of following a false pope and someone who doesn't have the authority of the papacy, as though he were the pope. And if one were to ask, well, which is the worst? Which is the worst of the two positions? One would have to say that the only, actually the lesser of two evils there, if you want to call it that, would be not following the authority, not accepting the authority of a man who really was the Pope, until that doubt is resolved. Because as long as one has that rational, that objective doubt about the reality of that man having the authority of a Pope, one must not obey that, in the sense that one must not take that risk of following what is essentially someone who's an anti-pope, in fact. And one is not responsible morally for disobeying an uncertain command with doubtful authority behind it. There is no culpability in that. Actually, one is just being prudent and taking the safer course. But there would be culpability in following the commands of a doubtful authority, especially if that doubtful authority is commanding you to do things contrary to Catholic tradition, contrary to Catholic practice, contrary to Catholic faith. If that doubtful authority is commanding you to do things that contradict the voice of the Church of the past, it would be certainly culpable to follow that authority. Mm-hmm. In fact, even if there was no doubt about the authority, it would still be sinful to follow that voice, which would contradict Catholic tradition, because Catholic tradition is the higher authority. If I were to ask you, as I have in the past, I mean, where would you find the higher authority? In St. Pius X, when he was the Pope, or in sacred tradition? A Catholic would say, well, obviously sacred tradition, because that is the work of the Holy Ghost. And the papacy was established by Christ to confirm the brethren in fidelity to Catholic tradition and sacred scripture, right? Right. Well, who had the higher authority during the reign of St. Pius V? Was it St. Pius V, or was it Catholic tradition? All Catholics would have to say Catholic tradition is the higher authority. The papacy exists to serve and protect that, and to propagate that Catholic tradition. Who has the higher authority? All the popes put together, or Catholic tradition? Same thing. It has to be Catholic tradition. The papacy itself was established by Christ for the sake of safeguarding Catholic tradition. So if a pope were to attack that, he has no authority to do that. And immediately one would recognize that is not the voice of the shepherd commanding me to do that. So I must reject that. So I think in answering the question here, perhaps, I hope I am anyway, that it would not be wrong in any way to refuse the doubtful command of a doubtful authority. Mm-hmm. In fact, it would be necessary, especially when that doubt seems to be, or in fact is, contrary to what the Church has always taught in the past. Okay.
Father, what do you make of this question of sedevacantism, or a heretical pope, in regards to the third secret of Fatima? There's been a lot of talk about that we most likely have not seen the true or the full text of the third secret of Fatima, that it was somehow doctored, and the reason being is because it explicitly said something about this apostasy in the Church. And we had an email from a viewer who quotes a Cardinal Chapier, he says the papal household theologian for many years. He quotes him as saying the third secret of Fatima says that the apostasy in the Church begins at the top. So does that word top, does that refer to someone who occupies the chair of Peter as Pope, but in fact was not really a valid Pope? And that could possibly be one reason why we never got the real third secret of Fatima. What do you think about that?
It certainly is possible.
Okay.
I mean, they talk about the fish rotting from the head, right? That's an old saying from, I think, Holland, if not mistaken. But what was said about Fatima, that the apostasy would begin at the top, that means the highest authority in the church on earth. And yes, that would be in the Vatican. That'd be with the papacy itself. That apostasy would begin there and spread from there. I don't see any other way to explain that makes any sense at all. And it coincides with what we know the plans are of the Freemasons to infiltrate the church, as Dr. Marshall wrote about, actually recently, and to gain control of the papacy. I mean, we're having this come from several different directions at once. And in the third secret of Fatima, that may very well be the gist of that secret. You know, the third secret of Fatima had some interesting peregrinations. It was written down twice. There's a longer version and a shorter version, evidently. It was finally actually sent to the Vatican, I think under Pope Pius XII. And in 1960, when we understand that it was supposed to have been read, John the 23rd was occupying the papal apartments there. Some would claim he wasn't the Pope either. You know, well, I'm not so sure. You know, I'm not ready to say that. But the fact is, the story goes, he called for the envelope. He opened it, read it, folded up the pages with the third secret written on. He folded it up, sealed the envelope again, and said it is important not to disturb the Catholic people with this, or it is not. Somehow he put it in such a way that we have to maintain the secrecy of this, because it would be cause unrest among the Catholic people. Well, it just so happens it was in 1960 that he conceived the idea of calling council, of summoning Vatican II. And I can't help but think that the juxtaposition of these two events is conceiving the notion of calling a council, Vatican II, and reading that warning from heaven coincided for a reason. And that this was a warning to him, but he would not sound the alarm to the rest of the people. One could almost imagine that he saw, okay, well, I can go with this or I can go with my idea. I can pursue my plan, or I can take this warning. And he stuffed the warning back in the envelope, sealed it up, and said, I'm going with my plan instead. And he did. And of course, the rest is history, as you know. Now, there have been those who have spoken out on the third secret. Supposedly, anyone who has been given access to it has been warned that they must maintain silence about it. But there are those, like Cardinal Ciampi, who have spoken out, who said, yes, I do. I have been told the third secret of Fatima, and this is what it concerns. I think even Benedict XVI talked about that at one point, about this idea of it emanating from the head. So I don't think there's any doubt about that, based upon what those who know have said, and what it all seems to coalesce with that idea that the attack on the faith and the apostasy, we talk about the apostasy, he talks about apostasy. And we're reading St. Paul's second epistle to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, about the great apostasy. I mean, what could be a greater apostasy than that, right? An apostasy that begins with the top authority in the church on earth, the church militant, and radiates out from there and infects everything. Now that certainly meets the definition of a great apostasy.
Father, do you think that Our Lady possibly could have offered any practical advice for Catholics if there was to be this great apostasy that emanated from the head? Do you think she could have offered any practical advice? If she did, what?
I think Our Lady already did. I think everything Our Lady said at Fatima, publicly in her 6 apparitions, and also to Lucia, to Jacinta, I'm sorry, while Jacinta was hospitalized, Um, those apparitions are again private, but they were still recorded. Okay, we know what was said there. I think Our Lady made it very clear that terrible things would follow. She didn't mention the great apostasy necessarily, but she talked about the terrible tragedies that would follow if her warnings were not heeded. She gave warnings as to what needed to be done. But I don't think Our Lady would necessarily give or have to give specific warnings about a great apostasy or whatever, because I think the Church throughout her history has told the Catholic people what to do in cases where there is massive confusion. Let's say the lines of communications are cut by persecution or whatever. And what the Church consistently throughout her tradition, throughout her history, has shown is that she wants her children, her Catholic children, to continue with the traditional faith and not to adopt any novelties. Time and time again, when the Church has been through this, and there's not been any moment of the Church's history that has not involved this somewhere in the world. I mean, there's persecution and hardship and again, the lines of communication being cut, popes dying and months passing without another pope being named. And the Church has been through some very, very hard times. And at every turn, she has always praised those who in times of uproar, confusion, distress, temptation, the Church has always praised those who have held on to the traditional faith, because they have always come through those times, Catholics, and stronger Catholics, for the hardship they have to endure, and their resolute holding on to the Catholic faith, the traditional Catholic faith. It all goes back again to St. Paul, chapter 2 of his second epistle to the Thessalonians. He talks about the coming of the Antichrist. And he sums that up at the end of chapter 2, that epistle, by saying that there will be those, the eklektoi, the elect, who will not be deceived. When all the rest of mankind is deceived by the blandishments and displays of the Antichrist, they will not be deceived. And he says why? Because they love the truth. And I think that's very important for us these days. To love the truth, to be offended by the lie. And this is the age, as Father Vincent Biccelli said in Rome, when I had him as a professor there. This is the age of the great lie. He said the big lie. That's what he said. I thought it was very interesting. And he explained what he meant by that lying has become the order of the day. And we see that, from the Democratic Party throughout society, right? How we lie to justify virtually anything and everything. But it's not just them. So in any case, but the chosen souls of God who will not be deceived by the Antichrist, who will be the greatest deceiver in history, they will be immune to his venom, his venomous lies, because they will love the truth. And the grace of God will be there to remain steadfast. But then he says, hold fast to the traditions you have received, whether in writing or by word of mouth. Well, there you have sacred tradition and sacred scripture, the two fonts of revelation, the very basis of the Church and our faith, sacred scripture and sacred tradition. This is the remedy he prescribes to immunize one against the deceit even of the Antichrist. Well, we need to apply those now. We need to go back to Catholic tradition and hold on to the traditional Roman rite of Mass, the sacraments, practice the faith as it was before the revolution of Vatican II, before John the 23rd declared the revolution. It's kind of interesting. John the 23rd conceived the idea of calling Vatican II in 1960 when he refused to announce the secret of Fatima, the third secret of Fatima. At the end of the council, according to Jean Guiton, who's a fairly public figure and fairly reliable in his statements, close enough to Paul VI. In fact, he was standing with Paul VI when Paul VI closed Vatican II. And Jean Guiton said that Paul VI turned to him as he was about to read the closing documents of Vatican II, closing statement, that Paul VI turned to him and said, "I'm about to sound the trumpets of the apocalypse." Now, you go to the apocalypse, what some call the book of Revelation, and you read about the sounding of the trumpets, and you know what that means. And the fact that Paul VI, knowing what he was doing, would say that, and then proceed. Well, when you read what Jean Guiton wrote about that, you can hear the wonder in his voice that, how could you tell me that this is what you're doing and actually then go ahead and do it? But it was a revolution, Vatican II. And so we have to return to the traditional faith, practicing the traditional Catholic faith. That means the traditional Catholic religion.
Mm-hmm. And Father, we've gotten a lot of emails, and a rather recurrent question we have is, we talk so much about being a traditional Catholic, but what exactly does that mean? And I believe you've given a very good definition, a precise definition of what you mean when you say a traditional Catholic, and I think that bears repeating. So if you don't mind, Father, could you sum that up again, where we have, where we, if I may, I believe that the 3 points are that a traditional Catholic will always and everywhere does what the Church has always and everywhere commanded. A traditional Catholic will never do what the Church has always and everywhere forbidden. But then there's also that third kind of qualifying statement where, we look to what the Church has done in times of crisis, what the saints have done in times of crisis, and then we follow their example. And I think it's important to kind of reiterate that definition of what a real traditional Catholic is.
Tom, we have done actually an entire show on that in the past, and maybe we should do that again now in light of all that's happening now.
Sure.
I'm afraid, I tend to be prolix, so I'm afraid we'll still be here in time to start the next show.
Sure.
If I get started here. So I'm a little bit wary of that. But I think it is a serious enough question. What does it mean to be a traditional Catholic? That we probably would want to devote a little more time than we can right now to it. Okay. Though your point is well taken, that I think it is a subject that should definitely be addressed again. So maybe we can make that the subject for the next show.
Sounds good. Well, Father, let's end with that. We have a lot of emails, like I said. I think with the Taylor Marshall video, we've gained a lot of subscribers and a lot of new viewers, I've noticed, from the email inbox, and we certainly welcome all of them, and we will do our best to answer all the emails we can. So.
Yes. Well, Tom, I'm counting on you to make sure we do that.
And I'm counting on you, Father.
Okay. We'll both count on the Holy Ghost to make that possible.
Sounds good.
And I thank our viewers, and thank you very much for being here.
Sure. Thank you.
And spearheading the show.
No problem. Yep. Thanks to all of our viewers as well for watching this episode of What Catholics Believe. Until next time, we ask that you all remember the words of Our Lady at Fatima, to consecrate yourselves and your families to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and to pray and do penance. Thank you, and God bless you.